Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today. It's the first time for months that I speak in person at an event. And well, it feels a bit strange, but it's also great to be in such a setting again. This is a very important topic. What I'm going to present you today is joint work with Christoph Pitz and Sebastian. And well, we have made some simulations and I'm going to present you the results from that. Let me just start and talk about the challenges which Eurozone countries are facing. And I brought you some data with the current deficits of France, Spain, and Italy. And what you see on the right-hand side are these deficits after the COVID or in the COVID-19 crisis, because we are still in that crisis. And for many countries in the Eurozone, and you see that here for the three large countries I just mentioned, the deficits now are bigger than they were in 2008, 2009 at the advent of the Euro crisis. And what you also see is that these actual values are far away from the targets. You see there, we have more than 10% deficit in Italy this year, probably in Spain last year. France is a little bit below 10% of GDP, and these are huge deficits. I'll come to the second factor, the debt to GDP ratio later, which is limited in the Maastricht Treaty to 60%. So you see already that there is adjustment or need for adjustment here. And what many fear is that this adjustment will recreate what we have seen after the crisis of 2008, 2009 into the Euro crisis, namely that austerity will actually dampen economic growth and lead to permanent scars in the economy. Well, now, what is going to happen? And that is not as simple as it sounds. Of course, we have the Stability and Growth Pact, and that has some very simple rules. It says, well, if you are away from your medium-term budget objective, which is 0.5% for most countries in structural terms, or if you have the debt to GDP ratio of more than 60%, you need to adjust that by 1/20 of the difference per year. But then how these rules are exactly applied, this is further detailed in the so-called vademecum. And if you have learned Latin, you know that usually vademecum means a very small book, which you can keep handy, a guide where you can always look into. But these vademecums are not very handy anymore. If you look to the right-hand side, these are two pictures from the last two editions. One is a bit more than 200 pages, and the other is a little bit more than 100 pages. And actually, it's not always easy to understand what is meant by these rules. And I already see Mr. Westphal there in the ministry. I'm not sure how many of those know exactly what is meant in those hundreds of pages. Well, here are the debt to GDP ratios, and what you see here is that maybe the adjustment to the medium-term budget objective might be the smaller problem. Well, there's usually the rule, you should make an effort, you should reduce by at least 0.5% of GDP per year. This is already quite significant, but what might be more of a problem is actually the 1/20 rule. Because for Italy, for example, if you look at it, the debt to GDP ratio is now 160%. And that means you have a difference of 100 percentage points to the 60% target. That means a reduction of 5 percentage points per year. Of course, now you have a little bit of growth of inflation, so that isn't really, don't need to pay down your debt by that amount, but still it's an incredible amount of austerity which you need for that. Now, simulating this is a bit complicated because we have a number of conceptual problems at the moment. We have in these deficits a number of one-off payments which are, well, which just will go away by themselves and which will not be contractionary if they go away. I mean, if your restaurants and hotels are closed and you compensate them for that, and next year they open again and you don't compensate that, then of course your budget shrinks, your deficit shrinks, but it's not necessarily contractionary. In addition, we have large uncertainties about the deficits in 2021. Already, if you look at the German budget last year, what the projection was, what the outcome was, and there might be a lot of leeway in there which will not be spent and not be borrowed. Then if you take a macroeconomic model, and we use NIGEM here from the National Institute, there's already austerity in the baseline. So we need to know what we add to that baseline. And what we have done here and what I'm going to present you is we have taken the NIGEM baseline, which already goes to a path which is sustainable in a way that the debt to GDP ratio shrinks, but not maybe as much as set in the fiscal rules. And we have made sure that the 120 rule is met according to the formulas we have found in the Vademecum. We have limited the consolidation to 0.75% of GDP until this path is met. And we have set at least 0.5% of GDP if the deficit is larger than the medium-term budget objective. And then we have taken whatever is necessary there as additional consolidation and have put half of that into cuts in public consumption and half into cuts in public investment. And then we have run all this through the simulation. When I'm going to present that now to you, usually you see a baseline and your simulation in a graph. I'm also going to show you that, but you need to keep in mind that our simulation is only the additional austerity which is not yet in the NIGEM baseline. So you rather should look at how the overall path is and whether this is a useful outcome or whether not. Let me first start with the results for Italy. On the left-hand side, you see Italy's GDP. And this small dotted line is the base. The purple line is the GDP with our simulation. And what really is stark in this outcome is that, well, the pre-crisis GDP level is only reached by the end of 2023, but which is worse if you implement that kind of austerity, the 2007 level of GDP is only reached in 2027. So basically this country after COVID and after the decade before that, the Euro crisis will have 2 lost decades. And we know from Latin America that usually already one lost decade can be enough for political turmoil. And I mean, we have seen problems in the Italian political system. So that is something I would be very worried about. What I'm also worried about is that the effect is permanent. So in 2030, GDP is about 0.75% below the baseline. And I haven't shown that here because the uncertainty becomes larger if time progresses. But if you go to 2040 or 2045, we still have a significant negative effect from this austerity in the 2020s, which we have simulated here. At the same time, the benefits are quite limited. On the right-hand side, you see the debt to GDP ratio of Italy. First, what the path would be without this additional austerity, and then the austerity we have simulated. And you see that debt to GDP is falling, but well, it's by 2030, it's just reaching roughly 130% of GDP. And the difference between the austerity and additional austerity and non-additional austerity scenarios, this is just marginal. 2 results from France and Spain. What you see here is story is not quite as stark as in Italy, but in France, pre-crisis GDP will only be reached in 2022. And again, even at the end of the simulation period, there's a permanent negative effect. But which is probably worse is that we haven't put that into the graph, but if you follow this line prior to the crisis and you prolong this trend, you will see that basically we will remain permanently below the trend. And well, of course, this is only a simulation. This is an NIGEM baseline with some additional austerity, but that is a pretty bad outcome if we now have that kind of permanent effect of the COVID crisis combined with the austerity to come. Spain looks a little bit worse. Spain has this, we reached the pre-crisis level in 2023. And again, GDP remains significantly below pre-crisis trends. And you see here, the difference here is larger and growth flattens out in the future. So the point is this really a decent policy approach? And maybe this is without alternatives. But if we look at the United States and the NIGEM baseline now has at least the stimulus package from early in this year in it, we see that a different policy approach is possible. Remember, there were some stimulus packages last year passed, and there was a big stimulus package of around 2 trillion passed early this year. In this projection, there's not yet the infrastructure package because it hasn't been passed yet. There's just a stimulus package. But still, the stimulus package here is enough to lead to a situation in which the pre-crisis GDP is reached later this year, and we return to trend. Yeah, there's no permanent scar, at least not in the simulation. Well, there's a new paper out from Olivier Blanchard and Jean Pisani-Ferry, and they argue, even though they think the stimulus in the US might be a bit too large, they say this is basically the right approach, because by getting back to the pre-crisis path very quickly, you prevent hysteresis effects and permanent scars in potential output. And maybe we should also think in the Eurozone whether we need a fundamentally different approach to fiscal policy in order to prevent the path which I have shown. So to conclude, the EU fiscal rules put a significant consolidation burden on major euro area public budgets. The GDP might remain below the pre-crisis trend, and there's a danger of a negative feedback from these underutilized capacities to lower GDP potential in the future. And at least in my eyes, fiscal policy should try to prevent that. Well, thank you very much for your attention.